The officer told him to get on his knees. A second later, the gun went off, and a decorated Army colonel collapsed in front of his 11-year-old son in the middle of a hospital parking lot. That moment lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it set off something nobody in that city could control anymore. Because what that officer didn't notice, not in that moment, not while he was yelling commands and gripping his weapon like the whole world was about to attack him, was a small phone camera shaking in a child's hands. And that tiny camera would end careers, expose a decade of buried corruption, and turn one man's death into a national reckoning. Now look, I'm going to tell you this the way people around here tell stories. Not like a speech, not like a courtroom transcript, just the way it actually feels when you look back on something that changed everything. Because the man who died that day wasn't some stranger passing through the news cycle. His name was Colonel Marcus Johnson, and if you ask the people who served with him, they'll tell you something simple. Marcus was the guy you prayed would be there when things went bad. Combat surgeon, field officer, the calmest man in chaos. The kind of guy who could stop a bleeding artery with his bare hands while bullets were flying. And yeah, that happened more than once. He spent more than 20 years in the Army and pulled over 200 wounded soldiers back from the edge of death. So if you're picturing some loud hero who walked around bragging about medals, that wasn't Marcus. He was quiet, soft-spoken, the type who'd sit beside a young private having a panic attack and just talk him through it until the shaking stopped. That afternoon was supposed to be ordinary. Marcus had just finished a PTSD support meeting at the Veterans Hospital. The counselor had asked everyone to wear their uniforms that day, said it might help remind them of who they were before the war followed them home. So Marcus showed up in his dress blues, ribbons lined across his chest, the same uniform he'd worn when he saved half his platoon outside Fallujah years earlier. And walking beside him in that parking lot was his son Tyler, 11 years old, skinny kid excited about the promise of chocolate milk after the meeting. "Dad, you promised," Tyler said, practically bouncing while they crossed the lot. Marcus smiled the way dads do when they know their kid is counting every second. I remember he told him chocolate milk and fries. That was the entire plan for the afternoon. Nothing dramatic, nothing historic, just a father and his kid heading to the car. Then the police SUV rolled into the lot fast enough that the tires squealed. It didn't slow down politely or wait for space. It cut across the lane and stopped sideways right in front of Marcus and Tyler. The door flew open, and Officer Kyle Harlan stepped out with his hand already hovering near his weapon. Now Harlan had been a cop about 10 years, long enough to start seeing danger everywhere, whether it existed or not. A few years earlier, he'd been shot during a traffic stop. Bullet caught his vest, saved his life, but from that day forward, something inside him changed. Suspicion became the lens he looked through. And when his eyes landed on Marcus standing there in a military uniform, he didn't see a colonel or a doctor or a father. He saw a black man wearing something he decided didn't belong to him. You know how people talk about snap judgments? Yeah, this was one of those moments. "You there," Harlan barked, voice already tight with tension. "Step away from the vehicle." Marcus stopped walking immediately and raised his hands slowly, calm as ever. Anyone who'd been around soldiers knows that tone. Steady, measured, the way someone trained in crisis talks when they're trying to de-escalate a situation. Officer Marcus said, "My name is Colonel Marcus Johnson, retired Army. My VA identification is right here." He held the card out, arm extended, so the officer could see it clearly. Harlan didn't even glance at it. Not once. "Turn around," he snapped. "Hands behind your head." Tyler looked up at his dad, confused. Dad Marcus kept his eyes on the officer. "It's all right, buddy," he said softly. Then he tried again. "Officer, we can talk about whatever concern you have." But Harlan's voice only got louder. "On your knees." Now here's the part people still argue about to this day. Marcus didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't shout. He just stood there, hands still raised, and said something very simple. "I'm not resisting you, but I'm not kneeling." And if you understand what that meant to him, you understand the whole story. Marcus Johnson had knelt before, beside wounded soldiers, beside dying friends in muddy fields, holding pressure on wounds while helicopters circled overhead. But he wasn't about to kneel in front of his own child because someone decided he looked suspicious. Tyler's hands started shaking as he quietly lifted his phone and began recording. Marcus had taught him that a long time ago. If something feels wrong, document it. The kid whispered, "Dad," and Marcus answered without looking away from the officer. "It's all right." Then he tried one more time. "Officer, my son is right here. Let's slow this down." Harlan didn't slow down. His fear twisted into anger, and his anger twisted into something worse. "Last warning," he shouted, raising the gun. Marcus opened his mouth to speak again, and the gun fired. The sound cracked across the parking lot and echoed off the hospital walls. The bullet struck Marcus in the chest and drove him backward. Tyler screamed so loudly people inside the building heard it through the glass doors. The phone camera shook violently as the boy ran forward crying, "Dad, Dad, please breathe." Marcus tried to inhale, but the air came out broken. Blood spread through the blue fabric of the uniform that had carried him through 2 decades of war. That's when Sarah Thompson came running. Sarah had been a combat medic years earlier, and she recognized Marcus instantly. In Iraq, he'd saved her life after shrapnel tore through her leg. She dropped to her knees beside him and pressed both hands against the wound. "Marcus." "Stay with me," she whispered, fighting to hold the bleeding back. Then she looked up at the officer standing there frozen. "You shot a colonel," she said, voice shaking with controlled fury. "You shot a father." Tyler collapsed against her shoulder, crying so hard he could barely breathe. Marcus's eyes searched for his son, and even through the pain he tried to lift one hand toward him. Sarah leaned close as Marcus struggled to speak. The words barely formed, but she heard them clearly. "Take care of him." A moment later, the breath left his chest and didn't come back. The video lasted 42 seconds. Sarah uploaded it less than an hour later with a caption that hit people right in the chest. "This man saved my life in Iraq. Today he was shot outside a veterans hospital. Within minutes, the clip spread through veterans groups and military families. Within hours, it was everywhere. Millions of people watched that child beg his father to breathe. Churches replayed it during evening services. Soldiers changed their profile pictures to Marcus's uniform insignia. And across Chicago, something shifted like a fault line cracking under the weight of the truth. But inside police headquarters, the reaction was colder. Chief Randall Pierce gathered his command staff behind closed doors and issued a familiar instruction. "Media blackout," he said. "We control the narrative." The official statement claimed Marcus reached for his waistband. Everyone in that room knew it wasn't true. But they'd buried complaints before, and they planned to bury this one too. Except something went wrong. Detective Ryan Patel, a quiet investigator who still believed the job meant something, accessed Harlan's internal file that night when the department servers began failing under the pressure of media requests. The folder opened and Patel stared at the screen in disbelief. 7 excessive force complaints over 5 years, all dismissed. Emails from Internal Affairs instructing officers to close cases without investigation. Witness statements altered, evidence labeled frivolous. Patel sat there a long time with his hand covering his mouth because he understood what it meant. Marcus Johnson wasn't the first victim of that system, just the one who finally got caught on camera. So Patel copied the entire file onto a flash drive and walked it to an independent journalist the next morning. "If the city's going to fight about this," he told him quietly, "they deserve the truth." When those documents hit the internet, the protests exploded. Veterans marched in formation down Michigan Avenue. Nurses from the VA carried posters showing Marcus's medals. Students chanted a line from Tyler's recording that spread like wildfire through the crowd. "Real soldiers never kneel to fear." Federal investigators arrived before sunrise 2 days later. They seized Harlan's weapon, confiscated patrol car data, and removed entire computer towers from Internal Affairs. One FBI supervisor told the police chief something that ended the argument immediately. The video speaks for itself. Suddenly, the case didn't belong to the city anymore. It belonged to the federal government. The Senate hearing weeks later was unlike anything people had seen in years. Tyler walked into the chamber wearing a small dress uniform jacket tailored for him. He carried the folded American flag from his father's funeral and placed it on the table beside Marcus's medal. Senators who'd spent decades in politics suddenly found themselves struggling to speak. Tyler looked up and said quietly, "My dad taught me to stand tall. He wasn't a threat. He was my father." That sentence echoed across every television in the country. Moments later, the doors opened and 2 federal marshals walked in. Kyle Harlan was arrested right there in front of the cameras for second-degree murder and violation of civil rights statutes. The room gasped as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Senator Elijah Grant leaned into the microphone and said something people still quote today. "Let the record show that accountability begins now." What followed was a cascade nobody inside that department could stop. Harlan was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Captain Victor Lang from Internal Affairs was found guilty of falsifying public records and obstruction of justice. Chief Pierce resigned in disgrace as investigators uncovered years of cover-ups. The mayor faced corruption charges tied to buried misconduct cases. Congress even passed sweeping police reform legislation named after Marcus Johnson. And a year later, at a ceremony honoring his life, Tyler stood before 4,000 military cadets holding the same folded flag. He looked out across that field of uniforms and said something that hit everyone right in the heart. "My father died standing so the rest of us could stand taller." Now here's the question people still argue about when this story comes up. Some say Officer Harlan panicked. Some say the system built him that way after years of protecting bad behavior, and others believe the truth sits somewhere in between. So I want to hear from you. If you watched that video, if you heard Tyler's testimony, what do you think really failed that day, one man? Or the system behind him? Tell me in the comments, because stories like this don't end when the video stops. They keep going in the conversations we're willing to have.